Welcome to Marketing, Media, and Money, your go-to podcast for proven profitable strategies, secrets, and resources from industry experts and global influencers to help you scale your business, shorten your learning curve, and stand out in a crowded, noisy marketplace. Here's your host, award-winning marketing and media strategist and international speaker, Patty Farmer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Marketing, Media, and Money podcast. And I'm really excited because today we're going to talk about two things that I love, podcasting and Zone of Genius. I love both of those things. So if you've ever wondered how top business leaders manage to scale their operations while maintaining a seemingly perfect work-life balance, well, today we're just going to dive into transforming self-limiting stories, establishing strong business boundaries, and stepping into your zone of genius, but also how can those strategies enhance your presence and effectiveness as a podcast guest. So we're really going to dive right in to this, and we have the perfect person on the show today because she actually lives, breathes, and walks her talk on both of those things. So let me tell you a little bit about her. So Kimberly Spencer is a 16-plus year entrepreneur, a subconscious success strategist, an Amazon #1 bestseller, a TEDx speaker, a health junkie, a freedom lover, a 2-times boy mom, and an unsinkable optimist, helping visionary leaders transform their self-limiting stories, build their empire, stand out fearlessly, and make the income and the impact they deserve. So, we got a lot to cover in this amount of time we're going to have. But as you will find, Kimberly and I both talk fast, and we dive right in, and we love to get into topics, so this is going to be super fun. Make sure you have your pen and paper out, because I'm going to guarantee you that you're going to have some writer-downers, because she is going to drop some value bombs like no one else. So let's just dive right into that. So you talk a lot and emphasize how important it is to operate in one zone of genius. So I know what I think of zone of genius and maybe what my audience thinks of zone of genius. So can you explain how understanding and, more importantly, leveraging your zone of genius can enhance your effectiveness as a business owner as well as a podcast guest?
So your zone of genius, first of all, Patty, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm so excited to be here with you. And the zone of genius is one of my favorite things to talk about, simply because when we know this space that we can operate in, 90% of what you're doing in your business, you can basically chuck or delegate. Because when you understand what are the few pieces that you do so well as a visionary leader, and this is what I found for all the visionary leaders out there, the top level CEOs who I've worked with both as a coach and who we have as clients of our podcast guesting agency, Communication Queens, visionary leaders do best in their zone of genius with connecting, creating, and being able to challenge perspectives. So you hone in those 3 areas of your space, of how you challenge perspectives in your industry. That's what positions you as a thought leader. If you are creating relationships, that's how you develop and enhance your circle of 5, who you are the most like the 5 people that you surround yourself with. You grow your business based on the quality and caliber of the relationships. You build relationships with highly successful quality podcasters by constantly going on, showing up, building relationships of reciprocity and generosity. You're going to cultivate exponential return. Like one of our clients was just on Dave Meltzer's show, and Dave Meltzer invited him to go speak at his mastermind. Like, that's so powerful. And it came from a podcast interview. It came from opening a door and building that relationship. And then the third is creation. Now, it could be different for you than it is for me. For me, it's books, programs, being able to co-create with my clients on strategies. But when you can focus on your zone of genius, your zone of genius is a space that you do so well that it's almost weird in the paradigm of our matrix that you should be paid for it, because you're like, doesn't everybody do this well? But if you're able to communicate successfully, create, challenge perspectives, and cultivate relationships, those, when you can hone in on that visionary skill set, that zone of genius space is where you can lean in as a leader and then you have exponential return.
And I think it's really important to say here too, though, I think a lot of times people think, well, I can't charge that kind of money. That's like so easy. I always like to say the things that come the easiest to you are probably the things you should charge the most for, because it's probably not the easiest things for other people to do. So what would you say about how people could identify, like, working in your zone of genius once you know what it is, right, is a lot easier. But sometimes people really have to identify. Other people will tell you, right? Other people will say, oh, Patty, like, you are like a master networker and, you are a super powerful partner to have, or whatever the case may be, right? But the fact of the matter is that's once you actually identify that. And then, like you said, you build the relationships around that so that it is really powerful. But if you don't know, or you think you might know, but you're not sure, how would you say you could help somebody identify what their zone of genius is?
I love that, because I struggled for years in what I called my zone of competence, which is the area where you do a lot of things really well. I mean, I'm naturally multi-passionate. So like there's a lot of things that I can do as a business owner. And I think many of us as small business owners, especially in the beginning stages, there's many things that you can do okay. And then you graduate into your zone of excellence where there's some things that you can do pretty darn well and you get praised for them. Like, for example, my first business at 19 years old, 17 years ago, was teaching Pilates. I was damn good at that. It was in my zone of excellence. Within 1 year of teaching, I was the highest paid, most fully booked instructor at the studio that I was freelancing at. But what I didn't know that I was doing differently, that was my zone of genius. So what separated my zone of, excellence at teaching Pilates, I could see the body, I could make these adjustments. But when I realized what made me different, my zone of genius was that I would challenge people's perspectives. I would challenge what people thought was possible for their body. And that's really where I leaned into as a coach. And that's where I leaned into as a podcaster and as a podcast guest, is I would start going on shows and challenging, not in a way that I wanted to be divisive or polarizing for the sake of polarity, but challenging people's perspectives is what was possible for themselves, and giving them frames of reference, ideas, possibilities, stories, whether it's my story or some of my clients' stories, to be able to say, like, yes, it is possible for you to go on podcasts and profit on podcasts before even the episode distributes. And I've had people's mouths be like, well, what? Like, what? Like, I can get an ROI before a podcast even distributes? I'm like, yeah, because you're building a relationship with the host. It doesn't mean that the host is going to convert into being your client that's thinking a little too linearly and like transactionally. But the host, if you convert the host to being a raving fan, they'll go on and talk about you 5, 6, 7 times in other circles that you don't even have to walk in, because you're so freaking phenomenal at what you do. And so giving those perspective shifts, that's what I provided in my Pilates business. That's what I then later provided as a president of an e-commerce startup. When I had that successful exit, I then started providing perspective shifts in my coaching company, shifting people's perspectives as far as what was possible for their productivity, for their performance, for their level of success and fulfillment in their businesses. And then that's what we do, providing perspective shifts as far as what's possible from the power of podcasting.
It's really important too, because a lot of times people don't want to think about possibility, right? Like, oh no, like I want to know, like I live in the world of possibilities, because I think possibility is where profitability is. So like they're married to each other, right?
100%.
Right. So I think that's the space that I love to be in, which is kind of why you and I get along so well, right? But I think that a lot of times they do get caught up in those self-limiting stories, right? So once they actually figure out their zone of genius, right, they identify that, right? Now they kind of have to get past some of those self-limiting stories. But when they can, really, I think that one of the keys is sharing those transformations, and especially on podcasts, right? Because that can really impact your business and your personal growth when you're not just hiding behind your zone of genius, right? People want to know that, you didn't just wake up that day, right, And maybe you did have that zone of genius, like what you're saying, but you didn't really utilize it. You didn't step into it, right? It just kind of affected everything else you did. But the minute you step into it and now you purposely and intentionally do it, like it changes everything. So how would you say once they identify that and they step into it, when it comes to being on a podcast, specifically as a podcast guest, what are some of the things that they can do that they can step into that and make it so that it is transformative and it will impact their business, you know, not just, like you said, their ROI before it even is distributed?
I think the thing about your zone of genius, when you can identify it, and you touched on something about the natural aspect of the zone of genius, right? Like it is natural, but it's like not necessarily cultivated. In fact, what I've found in most leaders, it's the thing that you are most shamed for or chastised for. For example, like my ability to provide perspective shifts was not really appreciated when I was 5 years old, trying to shift my father's perspective as to why he should be sober. Like that was not appreciated coming from a 5-year-old saying like, hey, Dad, I see when you're sober, like you're really amazing and cool and you're acting like a jerk right now. But that perspective shift, that was something. So that was something that I started to question if that was my superpower, because like I then got in trouble for it. I then got in a lot of trouble for it. And I got punished for that experience. But later on, I started to realize, wow, this really is my gift. And that got to heal that relationship because of the power of always being able to see. I'm that weirdo who can always find a silver lining in pretty much anything. And when you're going on podcasts, in order to really have that conversion aspect, you have to do what I just did. Share a little story. Share a story of something that is an example of how you shifted a perspective, or of how you lived in your zone of genius, doing what you do really epically in the vein of a story. It can be when you didn't know you had your superpowers of your zone of genius and you were suddenly discovering what that was. Like I shared my story earlier about Pilates, and like I was a really excellent instructor, but that wasn't the thing that set me apart and made me the highest paid, youngest, most fully booked instructor within a year. Like what set me apart was the challenge and was that little extra zone of genius piece, because every other instructor in the studio could teach Pilates too. But for some reason, my classes were the ones that were always fully booked. And it's when you can start identifying what are those stories that correlate to your message so that you can demonstrate your zone of genius, not just talk about the area of your expertise. Because there is one of my favorite marketers, Billie Jean is King, Billie Jean is Marketing. He said that, I think it was on the Ed Milet podcast, and he was sharing as a Black man, like how he would go in for meetings and have to, he realized that he would have to be the one who showed rather than told. He would have to show the results. He couldn't just talk a good game and get people to buy in. He would have to show the results. And so he stated this principle of show rather than tell. And your stories show credibility, whether it's your stories or the stories of your clients. Like when I dropped the fact that one of our clients was invited to Dave Meltzer's mastermind on his podcast because he was on the podcast, like literally on the podcast, got an invitation to go to another speaking gig simply because of the information that he shared on that podcast. Like that's the power of that's a social proof example that demonstrates the power of what we do as an agency. It demonstrates the power of podcasting. And it also gives a real life example of a testimony for possibility of how you can expand podcasts beyond the scope of the podcast. So it hits it 3 ways.
Which I think is really important too, because, you know, nowadays it used to be that you couldn't believe what you hear. Now you can't even believe what you see sometimes, right? You know, and so it's important to be able to back those things up. Credibility is probably more important now than it ever was. I mean, remember in the day when, not that long ago, actually, when people would do testimonials and do their first name and last initial and that kind of stuff, that just won't fly anymore. Now people want to see, we want to know their full name and a website so that we could literally go check it out to make sure that's really true and that's not your sister or whatever the case may be, right? So I think that's really important, though, that we live in a time now where that's a possibility though, because if you are walking your talk, right, and you are, living within your zone of genius, then you don't have to worry about any of those things, right? I think it is really important. And to your story, I love that. I think when I was very, very young, my parents called me Chatty Patty, and they used to tell me all the time they'd give me $5 if I could just be quiet, right? If I could just be quiet. I never got the $5, not ever, one time. But what it did was it made me feel like I should be quiet. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I really stepped into using my voice, right? And really understanding that I didn't have to listen to that, right? That was somebody else's story. I got to have my own story. And my story is loud and proud. I have something to say, right? And so I think it is really important to really know what that is. But I also feel like a lot of times, and I think you'll agree, that when people really don't know what that is, that's when they're doing this spray and pray kind of thing, right?
Spaghetti wall.
Yeah, like I call that, spaghetti, lazy marketing, right? But for me, like I'm in the marketing business. Do you know how many marketers there are? If you don't know how to stay in your zone of genius and you don't know what your differentiators are and how to stand out, you could get lost in a sea of marketing people, right? So I think it is really important. And it's almost like a balancing act too, right? So I think that it's not just us too. It's all about having a good team behind us too. We don't do everything we do all by ourselves. And I know that you have a process that you help business owners hire their dream queen team, right? For those of you, like really honestly, she is the queen. We both actually came on the podcast with our crowns on, then decided we would take them off. But we had them and stuff though. But how do you help them hire their dream queen team? And really, as far as zone of genius and podcast guesting, really, what are the benefits of having the right team in place? Because man, it is a make or break thing for me.
So to give you an example, when I was stuck in Australia in 2020, we got stuck there during COVID. And my primary source of lead generation, which prior to that had been live events, was shut down. I had a small team of 2 VAs. That was it. And 1 editor for our podcast, who was on a freelance basis. And we pivoted our strategy into targeting podcasts, and we started reaching out to 100 podcasts per week. Now, that was taking up about 40 hours of my team's time to be able to track, build the spreadsheet, follow them on social media, follow up, email, all of that to target these podcasts. That understanding, I also am a mom. Back then I only had 1 child. Now I have 2. And there's no way that I could find 40 extra hours in my week without sacrificing my sleep, which I'm unwilling to do. And I think you have to realize, to go back to your zone of genius, what is your zone of genius when hiring team? For me, you want to delegate out to that which is not in your zone of genius as a leader. And so when I am in my space as a leader, I know that I look at the entire process. I'm a Virgo, so I can see a whole process mapped out like that. And that, when you can see the process from start to finish, compiling the spreadsheet, doing the research, all of these things in my total zone of competence, I totally could do if I wanted to. Researching, finding the podcast, putting them all into a spreadsheet, initial emails sent out. Hey, are you taking guests? Curious, who's your booker? Initial emails sent out. Following them on social media, dropping them a DM on social media. All of these 5 things I could do, but they are in my zone of competence, not in my zone of genius. Where it gets to me being actually in my zone of genius with that process is between clicking on the link to show up to the podcast, building the relationship with the podcaster, and then clicking on the link to sign off, dropping some promotion for the podcaster, sharing about their episode, continuing to further a relationship of reciprocity and generosity with the podcaster, also thanking their team if any of their team members were involved, dropping reviews, etc. And then any of the follow-up of the process of being on a podcast, tracking the podcast, checking if it got distributed yet, writing the email, building the social assets to promote it. Because sometimes podcasts won't always give you social media assets. So being able to share about it, all of those things, also not in my zone of genius. All that's in my zone of genius is that 20% of the time, which is the most important, obviously showing up to the podcast interview, you have to show up, but that's my zone of genius. I build my team around that. And I know when you're first getting started, especially if you're solopreneuring it and you're like, I can do all these things. Yeah. But should you? And as you adopt more responsibility in your life, more powerful, influential relationships, more responsibility. Maybe you have I have a home now. I have a freaking homestead with 9 chickens and 2 donkeys and 2 goats and 2 children and my 4 children and my husband. Only one husband. The second one was I ended that one before I started the second one.
That was in your zone of genius.
Good choice. In my zone of genius. I picked a husband in my zone of genius. He's amazing. We've been together 12 years now. He's awesome. Best baby daddy I could have ever hoped for. But I picked a good team member. The first time around, I was young, dumb, stupid, pulled a Britney, did not pick a good team member who was a fit for where I wanted to go. For where I wanted to go, I needed someone who would be able to fully support me. Who you pick as a spouse, just as that's the most important team member next to the integrator that you hire for your business. Building the team is just as important. Building the team at home, who's supporting you, who's really around you, who's your community at your home, as well as who's your community in your business and who's your team in your business. Both are going to be supporting you. And if you don't, I've seen so many clients who have they have an okay team in their business, but their home life team is suffering, and thus they feel unhappy and unfulfilled. So building a great team, it goes beyond the purview of just I just need a VA for my business. Yeah, you probably do. And what's the level of team support? How do you approach your home life as a team? Because each of these aspects, if you're going on more podcasts, I know I have to have my husband, who's right now with the baby or the toddler, oh my gosh, he's 3, but who's with the toddler right now taking a nap. Good for them. But I have to have that support. And I know that when my toddler wakes up in about 5 minutes, that my husband's going to quietly take him out of our bedroom into, the Imaginarium to put him upstairs so that he can play and whatnot. And we call our playroom the Imaginarium. It's a, when you but you're teaching them, you have to have that level of support. And so especially if you're a mom and you're going on these shows, you either have to have the support of the podcaster structuring when you're going to schedule the shows around your kids' daycare or your home care schedule, or you have to hire support or have your partner or husband or nanny come in and have that support too. I look at support holistically. And if you're looking for support in getting booked on podcasts, you can easily start with a VA, start with a service like podcastguest.com, Podmatch, Matchmaker.fm. Those are all great ones to start with, to start building support so you can start building those relationships. And then as you grow, you can go and do bigger services like podcast guesting agencies like ours or whatnot. But it starts with support and knowing where in the process is your zone of genius. And odds are for most visionary leaders, it's not filling out those spreadsheets and doing all the research and data collection, even if you can.
I think that's kind of key there, because I think a lot of times what happens is people build team and hire for where they are right now. And really, it's about hiring for where it is that you want to go. And you need to kind of think about growth, right? Because you want to be able to grow, scale, and sustain what you do, right? And I think a lot of times this is all that I need now. But I think it is important to think about, where is it that I want my business to go? And then I also think that, and I was actually guilty of this early on in my business too. I don't know how many other people have thought to themselves, if I could just clone me, if I just had another Patty, I thought that was the end all be all. If I could just find another person like me. But that really wasn't the answer, because I did hire people that weren't quite me, but close, right? But really that isn't it, because the more people that you hire are just like you doesn't help you to get things done, because what about all the things that you either don't like to do or they're not in your zone of genius, right? So you need people who are in the zone of genius that you need, that's not your zone of genius. So when you're helping these business owners in creating repeatable systems, right? See, that's where I think it's key, right? It's the repeatable system and process, right? That's how you're going to be able to scale and be more efficient. And I have to tell you, I think in podcast guesting, that is so absolutely true. Like, I know that I have SOPs and exactly my team knows just what to do, not just for my podcast, but I mean, like literally in the last 2 days, I have guested on like 4 podcasts. I'll probably be on like 8 podcasts this week. Maybe it's only 7. But like when you're doing that, like you have to have a repeatable system in order to get it done, be able to promote, and to be able to build that relationship with the podcast host, which is really where it's all about. So how do you help people to be able to, like, I know you have an agency, but do you show them, and what are some of the strategies, about building a system and a process that will help them to do that?
100%. Yes. Like, this is definitely going into what we have in our book. Like, we use project management software called Trello. And we treat podcast production and podcast guesting like Hollywood. So that was my background, like to support myself while creating my career in Hollywood and getting my first feature film produced and distributed and picked up by Lionsgate and Netflix. I was supporting myself as a Pilates instructor. But because I was working and interning in Hollywood, I saw that the standard of production, and there's 5 basic standards of production. You have in development, pre-production, production, post-production, and distribution. So if you structure your project management in that space, in development for podcast guesting, that is where you're in development. You're in talks with getting on that podcast. Now, we don't put in development typically because we're reaching out to so many podcasts. We're in conversation. We don't put in development too much on the board. We have those for a spreadsheet. But once we get into the conversation where we're having getting our clients pre-calls, or I'm going on pre-calls, that's when we start to go in the pre-production phase. Then production happens. Right now, we're currently in the production. Post-production is predominantly on the podcaster, but as a guest, you also have some post-production tasks to take care of, such as before the podcast even gets distributed, share with people that you are on a podcast. Why? This produces social proof for you to go on more podcasts. It says, hey, I'm somebody who's consistently going on big podcasts. Like, this is something that builds your credibility so that other podcasters see, wow, she's going on these podcasts. And then you have another touch point when the podcast gets released, and then they get to see, wow, she's really amazing on these podcasts. So building that credibility during the post-production phase, while the podcaster is doing all the hard work for you of, producing, editing, or, not just the podcaster, but their team is doing all that hard work of producing the episode and getting all it set, you looking and sounding nice. You use this time to pre-promote the podcast and build your relationship with the podcaster. We have a whole list of steps that include, post on social media, specifically LinkedIn, share that you were on that podcast, give them a link to the podcast, pre-promote it. Secondly, we also have a 2-way review system with the podcaster. So I do a review of the podcaster does a review of me. This allows me to collect testimonials. This is what we do for our clients. We collect testimonials then that we can then use public facing for more pitches when the podcaster is like, oh my gosh, this guest blew my mind. And then you can also use those for your speaker reels, for speaker engagements, you name it. You then collect a testimonial. You then also build the relationship of reciprocity. If you find out something that the podcaster is looking for, like a book, a tool, a resource, they're struggling with a pain point, they're wanting to get somewhere farther in life, like give them a book, a tool, a resource. And typically a pain point that most podcasters have is monetization and finding great guests. And so if you're a great guest, if they're wowed and dazzled by you, give them another referral. Give them a referral to somebody in your network who does similar to what you do, but doesn't do exactly what you do, and then pass off that referral. And then also, give them a monetization opportunity by having them join your affiliate program. And then that way, all the links that they use in their description can be affiliate links.
Which I think makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's a win-win for everyone.
And I think a lot of times people don't really think of those things. I really think that is one of the most important points, because even though everybody's heard all the statistics about how many podcasts there are and stuff like that, it's still a pretty small world. And I have to tell you, I hear from people all the time, "Oh, Patty, I'd love to have you on my podcast. This person said how great you were. This person said how great you were." And sometimes it's because they listen to my podcast. Sometimes it's because they've heard me on other podcasts. And sometimes somebody else told them, right? And I think that's important. But one of the things that you haven't yet said, I know you just haven't got there yet, that I think is so important, and what really works for me, is introductions, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the gift that keeps on giving. I just know that once I'm on somebody's podcast, it's like it really is easy for me to make introductions for them. And the introduction doesn't have to be about being a guest on their podcast, right? It could be something that they said, like they could say that, they're having this event, or it could be that, just from reading their bio, you find out that they're a speaker, right? And so I'm a speaker, right? And I know a lot of other speakers, right? So it's really easy for me to do introductions for them for something else. So it's not like, oh yes, our relationship isn't going to stop once you're on my podcast. It's literally just starting. We're in the very beginning, even though we may have had a relationship before. But the fact of the matter is we're just continuing the conversation after that, and all the different ways that we can best serve each other. So I think that, I don't think people realize that, maybe that 45 minutes that you spend with somebody, like that 45 minutes could lead to literally thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah. So far, over $250,000 in new business revenue directly attached to podcast guesting, just for my coaching business alone. And I think I love what you said, Patty, on introductions and how the podcast interview, that 45 minutes, it's just opening the door. I like to think, and I'd like to shift everyone's mindset and perspective into, instead of thinking of podcasts, and this is what most people do, they treat them like a one-night stand. So it's kind of like that scene from Sex and the City where Miranda and Steve first starts dating, and she's like, "Thanks for the sex, bye." Versus in a podcast, it's kind of like, "Thanks for the visibility, bye." And then you leave, and then you don't hear from the person, and then they don't really promote your episode, and they don't really share anything about it. And there's that dynamic of this like one-time experience versus think about a podcast interview like a first date. And now there's a reason also as to why I give such a sexual innuendo, because I know that in communication and linguistics, laughter and sexual innuendos will trigger a longer-term response in the brain. And so that is why I give this reference, because when you shift from thinking about podcasts as a one-night visibility opportunity to a longer-term relationship and actually have the podcast be a first date, that opens up the possibility of all the potential business that could be done in a longer-term business relationship, that's when you have a magical shift happen. Now, just like first dates, not every first date needs to be pursued for a second date. And there are certain boundaries, obviously, that come with that. Like, for me, a hard boundary is if there's a hard sell at the end, like of where the podcasters obviously turn their podcast into like a funnel of some sorts. And I don't know who's teaching this, but I know somebody is, because there's enough people who have done it, where it turns into a hard sale funnel, where they then use what you said in the conversation, especially if you share something vulnerable and courageous and bold, but deeply authentic and personal. And then they use that as a selling point for their program. That's gross to me and manipulative. And those podcasters immediately get put in our dungeon and on our do not call list, because that to me, if you're going to manipulate somebody's words against them to then sell them your program, you're not interested in a transformational relationship. You're still looking at everything like a transaction. So those are the relationships that I would say don't continue on. But there's sometimes I've had a podcast interview where the host was like, well, I feel like you were talking directly to me. And I was asking this, and this specific question specifically regarding my problem. And I'm like, oh, tell me more. What's going on? And, I was literally on one just 2 hours ago. And she was like, oh, well, I was talking about this and this challenge and this experience. And I said, well, okay. And then I just started kind of sharing. And she was like, well, I'd love to know about your packages and how you work. And it came out of an organic conversation with a desire for service, not I'm going to go on this podcast and convert every host into being my client. Because that's looking at relationships transactionally, which is gross. It's like the guy who's looking at, going around at the bars looking for their hookup. Like, don't do that. Go looking
the other way too.
Yeah, the other way.
Actually seeing people where podcasters have also had people on their podcast for the exact same reason, which I also think is gross. I'll never forget one time, big name too, which I won't mention. I was on a podcast and literally their topic that they wanted me to talk about is something that I'm really known for. Every single question. I don't mean a couple questions. I mean, every single question she asked me, when I answered her question, the next thing out of her mouth was like, oh yeah, that's what we do for our clients too. Like, and then she would go on this big thing for like 5 minutes about how they did that for their clients and the results I got. Like at the end, I felt like, why did you even have me on your podcast? You could have just did a solo episode, right?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So I've had those things happen too.
Same.
Right. Then that's really all about learning how to control the narrative, right? And the more experience you have, the better you will get at that. But I have to say, when you are thinking about it, like you said, it's a first date. And then what happens next? I have to tell you, I have learned so much from the people that I have on my podcast. This is what they came on to talk about. And then I learned so much about them that the introductions that I can do or the referrals that I can do or whatever, a lot of times aren't even about the thing that they actually came on my podcast to talk about. And then you really do have a relationship because you find out you have all these other things that are in common, right? So I think part of that is actually sharing the stories too that are more personal and not just about, what you do, but really who you are. I always like to say, really, it isn't about what you do. I don't even use that question, even in networking, like, oh, what do you do? I don't really care what you do. What I want to know is who do you serve and who are you at your core, right? Those are the important things. And whether that's as a podcast guest, as a podcast host, or somebody who is working in their zone of genius, it still is what I really want to know. And so I love that you're actually helping people in both of those things, because I think it is really important. But you also said something earlier that I want to go back to about kind of having, the team at home too, right? Whether it is your spouse or someone else, right? But maintaining that work-life balance, right? And it is a balance, but it's never 50-50 or 100-100, right? Because sometimes your business needs you more here. Sometimes you're needed more at home, whatever. So it is like a seemingly balanced work-life balance, right? But what would you say when you are doing more than one thing, right? When you are doing more than one thing and you are balancing all of these things, you're running a successful business. What are some of the ways you can really personally manage this balance besides your amazing husband?
Oh, yes. Without him, I honestly, I have so much respect for single mothers. Cause I have no idea how I would do it without him. So to give you an example, because I always like to be very transparent with what my team looks like, because not everybody can have that. Everybody can have that, but not everybody has that at this moment. My team structure at home, I have my 3-year-old, my almost 7-year-old. My 7-year-old is now doing a lot of help with my 3-year-old with kind of guiding him sometimes. Sometimes it turns into a fight. And then I have my husband, and then I have my mom who lives with us as well. And so my mom is our granny. So she's currently running and picking up my almost 7-year-old. I'm getting used to saying 7 because that seems so old for my little baby. But that's my team structure at home. How I balance is I don't believe in balance. I believe in harmony. And if you think of harmony and your life like a symphony, There are going to be times a symphony would be so boring if it was only string section 100% all the time. Like, we like versatility in a symphony. And so the same is true with life. And like, I know for me that and I've said this to many, many moms who are mompreneurs as well, with young kids, where I'm like, that there are times when I think, oh my gosh, it would be so much easier if I didn't have kids. And then as soon as I think that, I'm like, yeah, but I'd be so much less fulfilled. I wouldn't know how to prioritize my time because I would just be able to work all the time. Like, it wouldn't be a problem. And I wouldn't be prioritizing me as much because I know that in order for me to show up well for my children and for my businesses, I have to show up for me 100%. And so I start out the morning with a workout with me. Like, that's my morning. I would say 80% of the time, depending upon which child has decided to join me in bed. Like, that's dependent. If it's the 3-year-old, sometimes I stay a little longer for extra snuggles just because he just wants to have that mommy time. But 80% of the time, I am waking up, I'm working out, I'm working on me first. I'm reading, I'm getting my mind right, and I'm getting into a space for, like, I don't need a bajillion things. I used to have a morning routine with like 15 things. It took me 2 hours when I had my first child. And I was in a coaching program back then. And I was like, I don't really need all this stuff. Like, I just really need my morning, my workout. I have a good protein smoothie filled with like probably 50 grams of protein with collagen, pea protein, chia seeds, athletic greens. And that's like my jam. And then I read, and that routine sets me up. And then I also spend quality time with my kids in the morning. Like, that's very important, is that we have laughter, that we have joy. Sometimes I'll take them outside. Sometimes I'll just, watch what they're doing on their iPad and like be involved with that. But being able to be a part of that is very important for me. And then I start my day. I now don't do meetings really before 9:30, simply because I'm realizing I like having a little bit slower mornings, and those boundaries have shifted radically. I used to be, when I lived in Australia, because of the time difference, I don't like to say had to, but I chose to take meetings as early as 7 a.m. because I was working with US time zones. And so my work hours would be from 7 a.m. to noon. And then I would have the afternoon off to just be mom. And so I think really it's looking at how do you want to structure your day, because, and I don't work on weekends. Like, I may touch my computer simply for planning on Sunday, but that's after I've spent a good weekend of just enjoying being present with my kids, taking them out to breakfast. Like, this week they ran a little 1K, which I was super proud of. Like, we just make sure that family time is such a priority. And I also make sure that time with my husband is a priority as well, because he is my integrator for the home. Like, I get to be the visionary in that space. And as we say in our house, like, I bring home the bacon and he fries it up. He is the integrator of everything that's going on at home. And so I make sure that he's very set up for success for that, and that we get to have that connection time as well. And I think that's
really important. I think that's really, really important. I think my husband and I, we married for 26 years, and we became a blended family when we got married. And I remember that because I am a fixer, right? I said, oh, we should go find somebody who specializes in that. And so we did, and we had 2 meetings with them, and they pretty much like laid it out for us and said, here's the deal. You have kids. And my husband and I together, we have 6 daughters. So like, that's a lot. And basically the number one thing he said was that every night at 7:00, we turned back into a couple. And we trained our kids that whatever homework you need signed, whatever you needed had to happen before 7 p.m. because at 7 p.m. we turned back into a couple. And literally we have done that for all the time that we've been married. We had date night where we didn't talk about the kids and we could talk about work. And I got to tell you, that was pretty hard and stuff though, but we did it. And I kind of think it's actually been the secret to our success as a married couple. But I think that whatever those things are, whether they're in your family, whether they're in your business, I think it's important. Now, for me, I love what you're saying about hours. I do have my process in the morning, but I do have 2 days a week where I have over 80 global clients, over 80 clients that live in Europe. And they're all in one big group program. And 2 days a week at 4:00 in the morning, I am on Zoom with them, right? And stuff. And so that is really important, but it's okay. But on Monday, I work on my business and I don't work on Fridays, or I don't work with clients on Fridays. I literally do, that's Patty Day. That's when I, massages and, lunch with your girlfriends and all those type of things. So I can show up and be present with my family on the weekends and stuff though. Now, does sometimes that change? Yes, I'm a speaker and sometimes I'm out of town on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But with that said, these are the boundaries, and whether it's with my team, with my clients, whatever, like I set those boundaries really clear. And I think that is really important. I think people will respect you for it. And I teach my clients to do it as well, because I just think it is the best thing. You'll be the happiest. And I have one rule for my business, which is I only do things that bring me joy and feed my soul. That is my highest criteria. And it is really, really important to me. And so I feel like that's how I keep balance for myself, right? Is I ask myself, does this bring me joy and does it feed my soul? And if it doesn't, well, then we need to kind of change that and stuff though. So that could be little things. It could be big things. So I think it is really important. I love what you're doing. I mean, 2 little kids. I mean, my kids are raised now, but I don't know how I did it when I raised all those kids. But I do a lot more things now. I do a lot more things now because I'm able to do a lot more things now. I travel out of the country a dozen times a year. But when you think about it, but you have to do with what you are in right now. But again, thinking about what it is that's in the future, I think is really important. Yeah. So thinking about the future, what trends or shifts do you foresee in the entrepreneurial landscape? And how are you preparing your clients to stay ahead of that while they're still operating in their zone of genius?
So a huge trend I see is in authority, reputation, and your credibility. So being able to walk your talk, have people build the know, like, and trust factor with AI coming into the marketplace, with the ability to adapt voice and all of the other things that are making people very sus in a way of, character of people. All of those things, people are, what I'm noticing is that people are taking a bit longer to just discern their trust. And when they do, and so you have to know that you're playing the long game. Like, no longer is this like 2019, the year of like, I made $6 million in 6 months sort of thing. Like, this is, be willing to play the long game if you're going to choose to be in business. And secondly, when it comes to podcasting, I see podcasters as being the historians of the future. And this is like thinking like way beyond, but in terms of generationally. But when you look at the types of content that AI is filtering, and AI is very much on my mind as far as like, I have 2 young children. I'm looking at the world they want to grow up in. One of them wants to be a robotics engineer. And so I'm very involved with like, what's on the forefront of like where their careers, where they want to go. Absolutely. And that's like, I even, Patty, this is how much of a crazy, like visionary, like person I am. I'm like, I joined a tech mastermind for my 6-year-old just so that I could be in the room to build the relationships, so that I'm like, okay, I'm thinking of him for down the future. Like, that's how crazy I am. But I own it.
It's crazy. That's crazy. I mean, that is being visionary. It really, really is. But here's the thing. So here's what I really kind of am thinking. So I know that you're getting ready to come out with a book on podcasting, right? So I really love that, right? Make every podcast want you. So I'm excited about that. But with that, let's kind of talk about this. So how can people profit from guest podcasting? And why is courage important for sharing your story and language in your communication strategy? Because I know you talk about that a lot. And I feel like you're getting ready to have the book come out. I've actually been watching how you have been courageous in sharing your story and really what your languaging and your verbiage is in your communication strategy. So really, I'm sure that when people know what it is that you do, probably one of the first questions you get, I'm just guessing here, but I'm pretty sure, It's about like, how do you profit from guest podcasting, right? That's what people want to know, right? So what would you say are some of the ways? Like, let's give us a little sneak peek of the book, which I actually know that you are really going to get the sneak peek when you're given the gift in just a second. But kind of just going into the profit part about, guest podcasting, and really profit could be a bunch of things, because I really believe that profit doesn't always mean money. I feel like profit really comes from opportunity. For me, that's what I feel like. And I think that is the big thing, right? Other people's people and all that. So let's kind of talk about that, because I really kind of want you to be able to tell everybody about your book. I'm really excited about the book. So yeah, let's go there.
So you can definitely, there's definite transactional profiting that can go down from being on other people's podcasts. I cite many sources of, like, for example, I was on my husband's podcast. One of his listeners was a longtime friend of his, reached out to me for coaching, $33,000 coaching contract right there. Like, that was a direct result of me being on his podcast, Values Match for Values Match. I've gone on podcasts, like one of the examples that I gave, as well as, like, I've gone on podcasts where I shared a very vulnerable story. I believe this was the story that it was back in 2019, and I shared the story of my, in total transparency. So trigger warning on this one, but that of the time that I was sexually assaulted and raped, and how that experience allowed me to basically calcify the value of ownership. And I shared about how ownership is so essential in leadership, in order to own your part of the story and not take responsibility for anyone else's. And that podcaster resonated with that story so much. Not that he'd had the same experience, but he saw that there were areas of his life that needed a little bit of extra support. And he reached out to me and asked, if I could coach him in that space. And it was in that moment that I was like, wow, I think that podcast guesting could actually be an open door. But it came from sharing a story of vulnerability and courage. And it takes a lot of courage to show up and share a story of that level. And I'm not saying that you have to have some, like, dramatic trauma that you share on a story, on a podcast interview. I, in fact, encourage you, if you have not healed that trauma, to not share it on a story and take it to a therapist's office. But if I like to say, if it's 90% healed, that extra 10% of the healing can actually come from sharing it, because shame loves secrets. And so when you share a story that has significant emotional meaning to you, and this doesn't, like I said, it does not have to be a trauma. It can be as simple as you felt neglected and alone in your household because you were a middle child. Like, it can be something like that. Like, but something that has significant emotional meaning. When you share from a space of vulnerability and authenticity, what happens is courage is directly equivalent to vulnerability, as the studies of Dr. Brené Brown. And so courage is actually an emotional vibration. If you've ever studied Dr. David Hawkins in the Map of Consciousness, and there are actual vibratory Hertz frequencies for each emotion, shame being the lowest, and that move up the scale and that actually create movement. Courage, like anger, there's anger, pride, and courage. Anger will activate, like we're definitely seeing a lot of that this current season in politics, where there's a lot of activation going on, but it does a lot of times that activation can be spinning people's wheels because it's not actually creating momentum. Then pride can accelerate, but sometimes it accelerates who you are in your mind and in other people's minds. So it doesn't necessarily, again, create momentum, because sometimes pride can create division. It can create a perception of, oh, this person's the all wise and knowing, and they're on a pedestal, and I'm down here and I could never get to that level because they're so high above me. Mm-hmm. Versus courage, when you speak with courage activates. Courage can activate within us momentous emotion that moves us forward. It is an emotion that moves us into action, positive, forward-focused action. And so when you are sharing stories on podcast interviews that are vulnerable, that are transparent, one of my clients, he was telling me, he was like, well, Kim, I don't have like some like horrible trauma story. And I said, well, what, tell me your origin story. He goes, well, I started my company like from the back of like my car, and I was, briefly homeless, like living out of the back of my car. And I was like, that's a story. That's a story that someone can resonate with. And that experience of being able to share those moments where somebody else is stuck, it allows you to be positioned as the guide in someone else's story. You want your audience member to see themselves as the hero, because when you paint the picture of where you have been, they will see themselves where they're currently at and then see you as that potential guide that can pull them out. And so when you're in that positioning of the guide, that's when you are in the space that's like, hey, I have a product, I have a program, I have a book, I have a course, I have a thing, a service that can help you or support you, whether it's a free thing or a paid thing. But it comes from being able to share from an energy of service and an energy of courage.
No, I think that is really true. I had this client, and she had a brother, and her brother was autistic, and her family had to spend a lot of it. He was pretty high on the spectrum and stuff. And one day we were talking, and she was telling me, how tough it was to be the sister, right, of this brother who needed all this attention. And she said, Patty, I found out that there's actually a term for that. It's called you're a glass child, which basically just means that your parents kind of see through you because they're so caught up in time and energy and emotion of taking care of the other child, right? And so you feel like they don't even see you. Once she told me that, I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my goodness. And we actually started marketing her as a speaker to that. Now she's done 2 TED Talks on it, and she is literally nationally known as the speaker who talks about being a glass child. And so many people have been through her program. And if she had to share that story, like literally she was a high performance coach. Like if she had to share that story, right? So sometimes the thing is not what you think the thing is going to be. And if she hadn't been courageous and shared that story, like I would have never known as her marketing person, like, wait a second, like this is how you can serve other people. There's all these other people who are glass children too. And like you could help them and stuff though. So I feel like being courageous and sharing your story is really important when you're doing it to the appropriate audience in an appropriate way as well, right? I have also seen people who have shared their story as a marketing strategy, right? I've even said sometimes like The Voice. If anybody watches The Voice, have you ever seen like when they tell their story to people that come on? Sometimes their stories are so authentic and you're like, not to say they're not all the truth. I'm not saying they're not, but sometimes you can kind of tell that the story that they're telling is like, vote for me, whatever and stuff. But sometimes the story is like super amazing. So, kind of know your audience, being appropriate, but being courageous is very, very important. So tell us a little bit about the book. And you have a gift for my audience too about the book. So tell us about it.
Well, Make Every Podcast Want You is the full title is Make Every Podcast Want You, How to Be So Radically Interesting You'll Barely Keep From Interviewing Yourself. And the biggest thing about this book is that, yes, I talk about podcasting. Yes, you'll get the 10 pitch commandments on how to pitch yourself effectively to podcasts to get booked on the big stages. Yes, you'll get our entire strategy on how we break down and position and get our clients booked on both the top podcasts and the podcasts that generate referrals, clients, revenue for their businesses. Ultimately, though, also the book will teach you how to share your story and what parts of your story and how to be able to communicate in a way that effectively converts people into your world. And there's a concept called the first 1,000 fans. And when you can get to that first 1,000 fans, this was an article, I forget who it was written by, but I do cite it in the book, that those first 1,000 fans, when you can get those first 1,000 fans, they are your raving diehard fans who will follow you to the ends of the earth. They will love it. And those fans can be your fans. They can be your customers. They can be anybody who's purchased anything from $1 to, $30,000 in your business. But making sure that you really honor and speak to and are able to serve through your story those first 1,000 fans. And when you can do that effectively as a communicator, you can get so many podcasts to want you. And because you're demonstrating a level of not only communicatory, that's a word, we're going to say it's a word, communication mastery of your oratory skill set, but you also are, and when you demonstrate mastery of your oratory skill set, you start to demonstrate mastery in the other areas that you are a master in, like you, Patty, as a marketer. Like, you're a master marketer, but if you didn't know how to communicate that you're a master marketer, it wouldn't resonate. So when you're able to communicate and tell your story in a way that positions you with the authority in front of the right avatar with the right angles, that's how you then start to profit from guest podcasting beyond the scope of just revenue into like real lasting long-term relationships that can truly be game changers for your life and your business.
Oh, I love that. So tell everybody about the gift and how do they get it?
Yes. So you can head to communicationqueens.com/make every podcast wants you, with dashes in between. And you can get the first chapter for free, as well as our email follow-up swipe files, as well as an invitation to our launch party on September 30th, where we will be having a pitch-a-thon with top podcasters. We will have so much fun playing around with pitches and podcasting, and you will walk away with, potentially podcast bookings for you and your, any friend that you invite. But that is all included when you just go to the link down below that Patty has in the description and click it and opt in, and you will get the first chapter for free, unedited. So pardon the grammar, the grammar errors. But you'll get that, and you'll get to read it, and you'll get to get started on your podcasting journey to leverage guest podcasting as a medium in your business.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So I think that this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for just sharing from your heart, being courageous to tell your story, right? To show us how we can show and share our story. And I really think it's really important how you really went into the zone of genius and really did kind of really marry very well with the podcast guesting. So I know everyone's going to want to connect with you. So what is the best way to connect with you?
You can connect with me on either of my podcasts, the Crown Yourself podcast, which dives into all the subconscious strategies to rule your life, or the Communication Queen podcast to learn how to better communicate like the queen that you are and get book and leverage podcast interviews for your success. Those are the two best ways. So the Crown Yourself podcast and the Communication Queen podcast. Head on to either. Yeah.
I love options. So that's really great. So thank you so much, Kimberly, for being here with me today. I appreciate you so much.
I appreciate you so much, Patty. You're such a badass. And I'm just so grateful that you invited me onto your platform and for what you're doing, for demonstrating. You are truly walking your talk when it comes to how you show up and how you support and contribute to other people's successes. And you are a master networker. I love seeing people who walk their talk.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. And to my audience, thank you so much for being here again this week. I appreciate you. I hope you have a phenomenal week. However, if you enjoyed today's episode, and I am sure that you did, please like, review, share the podcast on your favorite listening platforms. And if you haven't checked out our magazine, Marketing, Media, Money, please go over there, grab a free copy of that. I'm sure you will love that too. And you can get that by going to m3digitalmag.com. So m3digitalmag.com. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you for joining us today on the Marketing, Media, and Money podcast. To shorten your learning curve even more, make sure to grab your free copy of the Marketing, Media, and Money magazine at m3magazine.com. That's M3magazine.com. I promise your business will thank you.